Well, the time is just gone 7 minutes past 9, and we kick off this morning going across to be joined by Ashraf Patel, Senior Research Associate at the Institute for Global Dialogue. Ashraf, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Jummah Mubarak to you.
Walaikum salam, United listeners. Hope you all well on this Jummah.
Yes, Alhamdulillah, Shukr. Wonderful day, and looking forward to the blessings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on this day of Jum'ah. And Ashraf, we are talking about an article that you've co authored, New Forms of Corporate State Capture in the New Dawn, which is the title of this article that has been written. And again, looking at African politics in general, always these dynamics that seem to be playing out, in the term that you refer to in this article is Mobutism after Mobutu Sese Seko.
Yes, Inayat. I think if we reflect at the dire situation in Africa, most recently the Niger coup, the South Sudan, the Sudan civil war, Ethiopian Eritrea, the conflict in northern Mozambique, on our doorstep in Swaziland, as well as South Africa proper. I mean, if you analyze the collapse of large parts of economic spaces, be they the taxi violence, the zamazamas, you do see a major gap in governance and management. And I think overall the theme of the article basically is the thesis, Mobutuism after Mobutu, is a kind of African political scientist's thesis that talks to when dictators or authoritarian leaders such as Mobutu leaves office, and rightly so, through the democratic waves that we've seen in the 90s. Citizenry expected a new model of governance, a new society, a new possibilities, such as what we see in Asia, for instance. Sadly, what has happened 3 or 4 decades later is Mobutuism after Mobutu, meaning that the same old system of patronage networks, of corruption, of dependency on the northern system, of new waves of kind of dynamics that have made governance in Africa much more challenging as we face multiple crises. So yes, that is the thesis.
Yes. Now, obviously, you are talking about governments becoming redundant and what is actually becoming challenging for governments. And one of the reasons that you cite in your article that why governments and political parties have become redundant is they are no longer capable of sustaining democracy, nor are they capable of governing. And the whole question surrounding outsourcing. Outsourcing democracies to private sector and elites, which again begs the question that I raised in my introduction, that if we look at South Africa, or we look at South Africa as an example, was South Africa, was the ANC in exile, was the government in exile, and even after democracy, were they really capable, did they have the capacity to govern, or they knew at that point in time, we'll get into power, but we will outsource what we need to do?
Yes, the article refers to political scientist Peter Meyer, who is based in Holland, and he wrote an extensive classical book, The Hollowing Out of Democracy. And it shows quite systemically over several decades how the private sector and the phenomena of consulting firms like the McKinseys and the Bains that we've experienced in South Africa and other parts of the world, how they systematically work with political elites and then take over the public space, take over public sector, especially state-owned enterprises. And so the McKinsey model, for instance, is widely known globally as a model to take over government. And as government outsource functions to the private sector, the costs of those services then increase. And therefore, you're having this backlash from large parts of the population in the developing South on a kind of creeping takeover of government by the private sector. In South Africa, under the so-called New Dawn, under the Ramaphosa administration, has been going in this direction at an intensified level. So even publicly, as the government incorrectly states that McKinsey and Bain are out of the system, they still do consulting work for government. So if you look at the privatization of SAA, for instance, the looming privatization of Eskom, as well as Telkom, etc., you will see that this model of operation is dominant. And that means that these interest groups then take over democratic government.
Yes, Ashraf. Now, Ashraf, this is where the dilemma is. On the one hand, you've got a government that is elected, like the ANC, to lead the country. And obviously, at the end of the day, they are there to make decisions, they are there to effect policy, they are there to implement policy. But here you have now an unelected private sector that is basically running the country.
Yes, yes. You must see very carefully in the last 2 weeks, for instance, Business Unity, South Africa, BUSA. They a private sector interest group. But if you look at their so-called partnership, the CEO partnership with government in energy, in logistics, in crime, etc., etc., and if you analyze it using very important tools such as political science, you will see a very concerning trend that this interest group is now taking over cabinet functions. And then the big question is, what is the function of cabinet, of ministers of transport, of energy, of trade and industry, when government signs partnerships with the private sector? It excludes labor, it excludes communities. And so this falls within the trend of the outsourcing of government to the private sector. And so a very critical book, and I would encourage listeners to read it, by Professor Mariana Mazzacuto from Italy. And her book called The Big Con exposes the large consulting firms and their role in taking over government functions, in privatizing SOEs, advising governments to outsource, and they also then advise the companies that's going to take over the outsourcing function. So they play a dual role of corporate capture of the state. And this is a much more sinister trend than we've seen in the crude state capture years. This is much more sophisticated capture, and it all functions under the legal system, under the purview of consulting services. So this is academics are becoming very critical of this trend, and they call it the hollowing out of democracy. That means state capacity, democracy as a whole, is then corporatized for the elites. And this is exactly what is happening under the so-called New Dawn, under the Ramaphosa administration.
Ashraf, I'm actually fascinated by what we are discussing this morning, and I need to just engage with you for a little bit longer. If you would just bear with us, but right now I need to go for a quick ad break. We'll be back after this.
Okay.
Sponsor an orphan, and you'll help support a vulnerable child to have the education they've always dreamed of, so they can build a brighter future. You'll be feeding a hungry stomach and a hungry mind with knowledge that will last them a lifetime. That's the power of an education. Sponsor an orphan now with Islamic Relief.
There's no smell that takes me back to the comfort of my childhood than the smell of black seed oil being applied by my nanny. Now I'm using Tib black seed in my own home to soothe sniffles and coughs, to help with digestion and immunity, and of course, as part of my beauty routine. After all these years, I've come to appreciate the wisdom in finding comfort and shifa in trusted treatments like Tib black seed. You can find Tib black seed at all leading pharmacies or find out more at blackseed.co.za.
Conveniently located along the banks of the Crocodile River bordering the Kruger National Park. As a guest at Buckler's Africa Lodge, one can enjoy an amazing sunrise or sunset on our spacious deck area while you catch a glimpse of some wildlife sightings along the Crocodile River. The sounds of the African savannah will greet you whilst you enjoy your morning coffee. Buckler's Africa Lodge by Tingana Collection. Buckler's Africa Lodge is ideally situated only 6 kilometers from the Crocodile Bridge Gate in the Kruger National Park. Catering for all travelers with variety, we have 4 types of the finest rooms: superior rooms, deluxe suites, and 2-bedroomed family units. Each room is equipped with the finest amenities to make your stay unforgettable. Guests can choose between the self-catering option or book their accommodation with breakfast and dinner included. Buckler's Africa Lodge is your ideal location for the ultimate Kruger getaway experience. We specialize in exhilarating and educational game drives in Kruger, tailor-made to suit your family. Inquire about our various accommodation offerings and other activities. Visit www.tingana.co.za for more information. Buckler's Africa Lodge by Tingana Collection. Experience the pulse of Africa with us.
Ah, the kitchen, the heart of the home, where memories are made and celebrated. Our go-to place for those freshly stacked pancakes early in the morning or for the late-night snack munchies. We are in there together, cooking, eating, and celebrating life together. Let's keep the kitchen a place that is shared by everyone, where we build stronger bonds and grow together. Sunfoil, Now We Cooking. Visit nowwecooking.co.za for recipes that everyone can help make.
Rejuvenating media day by day. This is Salam Media.
Time is just gone 18 minutes past 8 as we continue our discussion this morning with Ashraf Patel, Senior Research Associate at the Institute for Global Dialogue. And this is an article that he has co-authored talking about South Africa, new forms of corporate state capture in the new dawn. Ashraf, just to continue, and interesting when you speak about BUSA, Business Unity South Africa. And we've seen very, very recently these CEOs which are represented in BUSA, some of the largest corporations in South Africa, the power that they have in lobbying government. But also we've seen this pledge that talks about Save South Africa, the CEO pledge about saving South Africa. Just how much do we read into this initiative and this announcement that has come through from all these CEOs in some of these largest corporations? Ashraf, are you with us? Well, I think we have lost Ashraf Patel. We're going to endeavor to get him back on again shortly. But once again, we are talking about what is currently happening in South Africa, where we see the African National Congress, this government currently delegating major government decision making to unelected private sector. And we see so much with regards to some of the key state functions that are being liquidated or being outsourced. I see Ashraf Patel is back with us. Ashraf, assalamu alaikum once again.
Walaikum salam, Inayat listeners.
Yes, Ashraf, just while we lost you, an issue that I wanted to raise with you is with regard to Business Unity South Africa. Now, we know that this is a very powerful organization. It is a representation of the largest corporations in South Africa. And recently, we've seen how powerful this organization can be in terms of how they can lobby at the highest levels of government, but also this pledge, the CEO pledge that they speak about, Save South Africa pledge. Just how much do we read into this? And I mean, is there hope for people like yourself and myself when CEOs come and boldly make a pledge like this to save this country?
Yes, you must remember the birth of these formations. If you go back to the state capture years, there was the Save South Africa. Now, yes, at that point, they harnessed civil society, labor, because there was a particular crisis at the time under the Zuma administration that needed to be corrected and changed. But what we saw was that agenda became, in the new dawn under the Ramaphosa administration, a very specific corporate agenda. And so they have moved headlong with their agenda, which is essentially the corporatization as well as the privatization of state-owned entities, whereas the Zuma years was mainly a grab through cronyism of state-owned contracts, tenders, etc. This strategy by like the likes of Busa is a more sophisticated kind of capture, but essentially a corporatization of state functions. And by hollowing out, taking over cabinet functions, as we've seen with the CEO pledge. In fact, just yesterday, finally, COSATU criticized this in a very big way to say, where is labor? Where are communities? When, say, South Africa wanted to change the state capture years, they used labor, they used civil society for that objective. But now in phase two, they're excluding society. So this is very concerning. And this is exactly the model. They call it the McKinsey model, where the private sector then takes over economic policy away from cabinet, away from elected representatives, into private hands. And so we're going through this model as we speak.
Yes, and also I think what you mentioned is very, very interesting. And when you speak about Kotsatu and when you speak about labor and the exclusion of labor, yet it was labor that was part and parcel of the alliance with the ANC that has kept the ANC in power with the majorities that they have enjoyed in prior elections.
Yes, yes. Look, this notion of the tripartite alliance was conceived in the 80s, 70s and 80s to overcome and defeat apartheid, and it achieved that objectives in the 90s. And so there was numerous debates whether the model is useful in a democracy. And after 27 years, it's quite clear that it makes labor, especially federations, ineffective because they have one foot in the government through MPs and cabinet ministers being appointed, and then they're also outside in society. And so this contradiction is now quite glaring and not actually effective. It doesn't serve their interests as members. In fact, their members will be on the front line as SOEs get privatized. Just this week, Minister Godan announced the breakup of one component of Eskom, the transmission side, and that clearly means that many thousands of jobs are on the line, and that means black workers in particular would be retrenched or redundant. So their members would suffer more than, let's say, more qualified engineers. So it is a very complicated situation, and yes, it's not effective at all.
Ashraf, the other question is who actually controls the purse strings? Because in your article, you speak of South Africa being a developing economy. We've got a sustainable tax collection base, and you speak of quality institutions that can solve the energy, transport, logistics, crime crisis, in this country. But again, it begs a question in terms of the control of the purse strings. Yes, we've got a fantastic SARS, we've got a wonderful collection base. We hear of increased revenue over and over again in terms of broadening the base. But when it comes to spending the money, and this is where my question comes in terms of purse strings in spending the money. Is it government? Is it through these corporates? Is it through organizations like Busa that the ANC has basically lost control and outsourced that function because the major beneficiaries of all of this is business in general, and also at the same time looking at you mentioned state capture, and also looking at just state-owned enterprises that have become basically a cash cow for the government.
Yes, Les. Look, in terms of political science, it is an elite model. But what's concerning this time around is that, look, South Africa has got competent institutions. So when the CEO pledge of Busa says, we're going to give government 100 million rand, and they call it a resource mobilization fund, why does a private entity give cabinet or government a fund? Is that not a form of capture? government has the resources. We have surpluses in the budget in almost every department. We have competent institutions, whether it's the CSIR, whether it's numerous scientific entities that can deal with the supposed crisis that Busa talks about. Why does the private sector want to take over rail? Why do mining companies want to own rail networks? When we do have, and then on this other hand, why is Transnet underfunded in this context? Why do we block coal, the mining of coal, in the midst of the severest energy crisis in the country? Why is there two centers of decision making around energy policy? So you have a so-called Presidential Climate Change Council that seems to have taken energy policy making away from cabinet. Then you have the various departments that are responsible for energy planning and policy. And so there's a contradiction. So there's literally two governments, if you like, that are at opposite poles. And that is why we have this gridlock. And it's exactly the Busa model that wants to push the privatization side as opposed to the broader cabinet functions. And so it's very complicated. So you don't have one integrated government. You've got two competing kinds of governments. And when you see the multiple crises you face in society today, especially energy and transport, this is now the result of this mode of lobbying by powerful interest groups.
Yes, Ashraf. And also, you speak about the Ramaphosa administration and how this sophisticated form of state capture has escalated, and it's been taken to another level under the Ramaphosa administration. And he's kept certain people very close to him. And the one minister, Praveen Gordhan, and we know that there has been a lot of talk as to the reason why Praveen Gordhan is so close to Ramaphosa. I'm sure he's had a quite a role to play in all of this and what we have been discussing.
Well, look, it's basically how politics takes place, behind the scenes, and it's nothing new. ANC has always had its various components over the decades and how they engage the different presidents. But the challenge, though, is that if ministers are given portfolios, whether it's public enterprises or trade and industry or transport, they have to perform. Every minister has competency functions. They have annual performance plans. And if you, after 5 years, you have not achieved key critical performance indicators, then why are you still in the same role? And I think these are the broader questions people raise. Why are some ministers more equal than others? And so that's a broader question of competence, of delivery, and these are being debated robustly in government and in the alliance. So I think there are many layers of complication and lobbying. But the bottom line is, what is then the public mandate? And if the public is not being served, then the president has to take decisions based on delivery and competence of all its ministers. And so that is the bigger question. Why are some more equal than others? And I think these are questions that are being raised in the public domain. So let's not personalize it, but let's say, but why is this minister that has privatized SAA willfully and almost for nothing, for 51 rand, for instance, SAA has been privatized? Why is Transnet underfunded in the midst of major crisis? Why is Eskom crisis continuous? Why is the appointment of the Director, despite him being not competent, why was he appointed and kept for 3.5 years in the midst of the worst crisis we face? So those are big questions that only they can answer. We just observers and analysts. But there are bigger questions that when one talks of private sector kind of interest and influence in the democratic process, and where does it leave society? As you can see, you as citizens, I'm a resident, we have suffered greatly in the last 2 years under load shedding.
Yes, Ashraf, unfortunately, time is of the essence and we have run out of time. But I'm sure, we've obviously covered so much. And I think there's still a lot more actually that is in this article. Sadly, we could not go through this entire article, but at some point in time, I think we need to have further engagement on this matter in a more detailed panel discussion. And hopefully, it's not very long from now, we certainly will be having this discussion. But for now, we thank you for your time. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam and jazakallah for the opportunity.
Ashraf Patel with us this morning. And with that, we're going to go for a break. We come back. We'll be joined by Khadija Davids. And this is part and parcel of Women's Month. And this is showcasing women in media right here with us on Salam Media.